The hall glowed with chandeliers that spilled golden light across velvet curtains and marble floors. The air smelled of expensive cigars, perfume, and power. Men in tailored suits leaned back in leather chairs, their voices low, their laughter sharp. To them, this wasn't an auction, it was a spectacle. And at the very edge of that stage, Layla stood waiting for her number to be called. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her throat was dry. The dress they had given her was elegant, but on her dark skin it felt like armor, a thin veil against the eyes that judged her. She wasn't simply nervous, she was humiliated. Around her, most of the women waiting their turn were white porcelain-skinned, their fear hidden beneath layers of powder and rouge. Layla's presence was different, striking, and in this room, difference was dangerous. She thought of Malik, her little boy's laughter, the way his tiny hand clutched hers when they crossed the street. Tonight he was at home with the neighbor, probably asking where she had gone, why she hadn't kissed him goodnight. She clenched her fists to steady herself. This was for him. The overdue rent, the empty fridge, the eviction notice on the door, all of it had pushed her here. The master of ceremonies stepped forward, his tuxedo shimmering under the spotlights. He smiled with the smooth cruelty of a man who knew exactly what he was selling. Lot number 23, he announced, his voice rolling through the room. An exotic beauty, rare and unforgettable. The word exotic stung. It was the word men had used all her life to remind her that she didn't belong, that her blackness was not normal, but spectacle. She lifted her chin, refusing to let them see her break, though her knees trembled beneath the glare of the lights. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eyes lingered on her skin, on her tightly coiled hair, on the shape of her body. To them, she was not a mother, not a woman with a life and dreams. She was a curiosity, to be bought, a prize to be owned. The bidding began. 500,000 one man called casually as though purchasing a painting. 700 another countered his gaze, hungry. Each number landed like a blow. Layla swallowed hard, her pulse racing. Every bid was another reminder that she was not seen as human, but as property. Then a voice rose from the back, deep and steady, carrying authority. $1 million. The room fell silent. Heads turned. In the last row sat Henry Lewis, a billionaire whose name floated in newspapers and business magazines. White, broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His wealth and power did the talking. The auctioneer's face lit with triumph. Sold. A gavel struck. The sound echoed in Layla's chest like a verdict. As Henry rose, the crowd parted for him. His gaze swept the stage and landed on her. It wasn't lustful like the others. It was colder, more calculating, as though he was inspecting merchandise. Layla's stomach knotted. She knew in that moment her life had been traded away. She stepped down from the stage, her heels clicking against polished wood, each step heavier than the last. The hall blurred around her faces, whispers, the acrid smoke of cigars. All she could hear was her heartbeat and the voice in her head whispering Malik's name. When she reached him, Henry extended his hand. His skin was pale, his cufflinks glinting beneath the lights. She hesitated before placing her trembling hand in his. "We need to discuss the terms," he said quietly, as if this were nothing more than a business deal. For him, maybe it was, but for her, it was the beginning of a nightmare she could not yet name. The limousine purred softly as it carried them away from the glittering hall and into the night. Layla sat stiffly in the leather seat, her hands clasped in her lap. Every bump in the road made her flinch. Across from her, Henry Lewis sat relaxed, almost regal, his gaze fixed out the tinted window as though the city beyond belonged to him. For a man who had just spent $1 million to buy a woman, he looked calm, almost detached. That unsettled her more than if he had ogled her. He wasn't intoxicated by desire, he was intoxicated by control. "Your name?" His voice broke the silence, clipped businesslike. "Layla," she whispered. He nodded, repeating it, as if testing the weight of it. "Layla." Then with a faint smirk, "Different. Exotic." The word made her chest tighten. She had heard it too many times. At school, from classmates who pulled at her braids. At jobs where customers told her she was pretty for a black girl. Even tonight, the auctioneer had spat it like a brand. She wasn't Layla, she was exotic, something to be displayed, not understood. Henry leaned forward slightly, his cufflinks catching the dim light. You understand the terms, don't you? This isn't companionship. This isn't romance. I need an heir. That's why you're here. Layla's throat burned, but she forced herself to nod. Malik's face flashed in her mind, his small, hungry frame curled beneath a thin blanket. Every instinct screamed to run, but where would she go? The auction had already stripped her of choice. The limousine slowed, gliding through iron gates taller than any house she had ever lived in. The mansion loomed ahead, its white stone walls rising like a fortress against the night. Dozens of windows glowed with warm light, yet the place felt cold, unwelcoming. The car stopped. A uniformed chauffeur opened the door. Henry stepped out first, towering above her, his presence commanding even in silence. Layla followed, her knees weak. The air smelled of roses and freshly cut grass, a cruel contrast to the decay of her own neighborhood. Inside, the mansion spread out like a museum, polished marble floors, grand staircases, chandeliers dripping with crystal. Paintings of pale-skinned ancestors lined the walls, their eyes watching her with centuries of disdain. Layla felt their silent judgment. She did not belong here. Henry gestured toward the corridor. You'll have your own room. Privacy will be respected, but you are expected to honor the contract. His tone was casual, like an executive giving orders at a board meeting. As he spoke, staff members gathered quietly in the background. Their eyes flickered toward her, curiosity, disapproval, even pity. Most of them were white, their gazes sliding over her dark skin, like a reminder she was out of place. Only one woman stepped forward with warmth. A middle-aged housekeeper named Amira, her olive-toned skin and gentle eyes marking her as an outsider in this world, too. She offered a smile that softened the sharp edges of the night. This way, Miss Amira, said, her voice kind. Layla followed her through endless hallways. She caught her reflection in a gilded mirror, a young black woman in borrowed silk, walking through a palace that wanted her body, but not her humanity. Her room was elegant, draped in ivory and gold, the bed large enough for 3 people. On the nightstand sat a contract embossed in leather, waiting for her signature. Layla closed the door behind her and pressed her back against it. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. She thought of Malik again, his laughter, his hunger, his innocence. Then she looked at the contract. $1 million for her womb, a lifetime of silence for her soul. And she realized this wasn't just a purchase. It was a cage. Morning light spilled across the room, gilding the edges of the silk curtains. Layla sat on the edge of the massive bed, staring at the folder on the nightstand. The contract. Its presence was suffocating, as though the ink inside carried the weight of chains. A knock echoed against the heavy oak door. Before she could respond, Henry stepped in, immaculate, in a gray suit, his expression unreadable. He carried himself like a man who had never been told no. "Have you read it?" he asked, his voice flat without greeting. Layla picked up the contract, her fingers trembling. The first pages were filled with clauses written in sharp legal language, but the meaning was simple. She would bear his child, then leave. In exchange, she would receive the money that could save Malik from poverty, hunger, eviction. "You want me to have a child and then walk away from it?" Her voice cracked on the last words. Henry crossed the room slowly, his polished shoes silent against the carpet. "Not walk away. Step aside. The child will be raised here with every advantage money can provide, and without a mother." "Without you, yes," he said calmly, as if he were discussing a business merger. "You'll have your payment. Your life will continue. This is a transaction, Layla. Nothing more." Her chest tightened with rage and despair. "Do you even hear yourself? You're buying a child. You're buying me." For a flicker of a second, his jaw tightened, but his tone remained cool. "I paid $1 million for you because I expect results. Don't pretend you didn't know what you agreed to when you stepped on that stage." Layla's hand shook as she gripped the contract. She wanted to rip it, to throw it in his face, to scream that she was not property. But then she thought of Malik, his hollow cheeks, his threadbare shoes, the way he asked when dinner would come, even when she had nothing to give. Every choice had been stolen from her long before tonight. Racism, poverty, a system built to keep women like her trapped, it had led her here. Henry placed a sleek pen on the table between them. "Sign it. Once the child is born, you'll be free. Until then, you belong here." The words stabbed deeper than he realized. You belong here. He didn't mean the mansion, he meant the cage. He meant ownership. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She sat frozen, the silence heavy with everything unsaid. Her mother's voice rose in her memory. "They'll try to take everything from you, but don't let them take your dignity." She pressed the pen to the page. The ink bled across the paper, sealing her fate with each letter of her name. Henry picked up the folder satisfied. "Good. Tomorrow we'll begin the medical process." He moved toward the door, pausing only to glance back. "Get some rest. You'll need it." The door closed behind him. Layla's shoulders collapsed, her breath trembling out of her chest. She looked at her signature, her name twisted into a weapon against herself. For Malik, she had signed away her future. And as the silence of the mansion swallowed her, she realized that this contract was more than legal binding. It was the silencing of her voice. The limousine glided through wrought iron gates taller than any building in Layla's neighborhood. Beyond them stretched manicured lawns, fountains spraying arcs of crystal water, and gardens trimmed to geometric perfection. The mansion rose like a fortress of pale stone and glass, its windows glittering beneath the morning sun. Layla pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass of the car window. The beauty outside felt alien, almost hostile. It was the kind of wealth built on walls that kept people like her out. When the car stopped, Henry stepped out first. He didn't offer his hand this time. He simply waited, his presence commanding. Layla followed, her legs unsteady. The air was heavy with the scent of roses, but it did nothing to calm her pounding heart. Inside, the mansion swallowed her whole. Marble floors gleamed beneath chandeliers that sparkled like constellations. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of pale-skinned ancestors in oil and gold frames, eyes cold and timeless. Their gaze followed her as she moved, whispering a message she already knew too well. "You don't belong here." Henry's voice cut through the silence. "Your room is upstairs. You'll have everything you need: meals, clothing, privacy." He glanced at her briefly. "But remember, you are here for a purpose." The word purpose landed like a chain around her neck. From the shadows of the grand hall, staff emerged quietly. Maids, butlers, guards. Their gazes flickered over her, some curious, some openly disapproving. She felt the sting of judgment in every glance. Her dark skin, her presence was a disruption in this pristine, whitewashed world. Then one woman stepped forward. Amira. Middle-aged, olive-toned, with eyes full of gentle kindness. She bowed her head slightly. "Come with me, miss. I'll show you to your room." Her voice was a balm, and Layla clung to it. They walked through endless corridors, adorned with Persian rugs and gilded mirrors. Layla caught her reflection in one, her face drawn with exhaustion, her tight curls pulled back hastily. She looked like a stranger in silk. Finally, Amira opened a door. "This will be your space." The room was beautiful, dressed in ivory and gold. A canopy bed stood in the center, its linens untouched. On a polished desk lay fresh stationery, and on the dresser a row of dresses already chosen for her. Everything screamed comfort, but none of it felt like hers. "Thank you," Layla whispered. Amira gave a small smile. "If you need anything, I'll be near." Then lowering her voice, she added, "Don't let them see you as weak." Layla froze, startled by the quiet warning. But before she could respond, Amira slipped out the door, closing softly behind her. Silence filled the room. Layla moved to the balcony, pushing open the glass doors. Beyond the railing stretched acres of gardens and fountains, all glistening under the afternoon sun. It was paradise. But to her it was a prison gilded in light. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warmth. Malik's face rose in her mind again, his small smile, his trusting eyes. She had told him she was leaving for work, that she would call when she could. He had nodded, too young to understand the depth of sacrifice behind her words. Here, surrounded by riches, she felt poorer than ever. As evening fell, the mansion grew quieter, the corridors echoing with her own footsteps when she wandered. Each portrait on the wall seemed to whisper the same warning: "You are out of place. You will never belong." In that silence, Layla realized the mansion wasn't just Henry's home. It was a shadowed kingdom built on power, prejudice, and silence. And now she was trapped inside it. The morning began with a knock. Firm, impersonal. Layla opened the door to find Amira waiting, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Mr. Lewis wants you ready." "The car is waiting," she said softly, eyes lowering in something between sympathy and warning. Layla dressed in silence, her hands unsteady as she buttoned the pale dress left for her. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, she almost didn't recognize the woman staring back, her face tired, her eyes shadowed, her skin glowing against the ivory fabric in a way that made her feel both proud and exposed. The limousine glided through Dubai's glittering skyline until it stopped before a glass tower that reflected the morning sun like a blade. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and wealth. Nurses in crisp uniforms glanced at Layla, their expressions polite but cool, as though cataloging her difference before looking away. Henry walked beside her, his stride measured, his silence heavy. To him, this was business. To her, it was violation, doctor. Ibrahim greeted them with professional courtesy, his silver hair and calm voice a mask of reassurance. "We'll proceed with a full examination before the first stage," he said, gesturing toward the sterile room behind him. Layla sat on the cold table, her hands clutching the edge as machines hummed around her. She felt the weight of history pressing down on her, the echoes of stories her grandmother told about experiments on black bodies, about how their pain had never been believed, their voices silenced. And now here she was, part of a system that still treated her as less than human. The doctor's questions were gentle, but Henry's presence in the corner of the room made her skin crawl. His eyes followed every movement not with desire, but with ownership, as if the outcome of this procedure was an investment he was protecting. "Everything looks good," Dr. Ibrahim said after the tests, his tone reassuring. "We can proceed when you're ready." Ready. The word mocked her. She wanted to scream that she would never be ready to sign away motherhood, never be ready to carry a child only to surrender it. But she sat still, swallowing the words because Malik's face haunted her every breath. As the doctor prepared the paperwork, Henry finally spoke. "This is necessary. You'll be compensated well. Your son will have a future you could never give him otherwise." Layla's fists clenched. She wanted to shout that Malik's future shouldn't depend on her body being sold, that no amount of money could erase the humiliation of being treated like property. But her voice faltered under the weight of Henry's gaze and the memory of eviction notices stacked on her kitchen table. The procedure was quick, clinical, and suffocating. Layla stared at the ceiling, counting the seconds until it was over. She imagined Malik's laughter, his small hand in hers, using it as armor against the cold touch of machines. When it ended, she slipped off the table, her body trembling, though no one seemed to notice. Henry simply adjusted his cufflinks, his face as calm as ever. On the ride back to the mansion, Layla pressed her forehead against the window, watching skyscrapers blur into desert sands. To the world outside, Henry Lewis was a titan of industry, a man whose name meant power. To her, he was a reminder of every injustice, every wall built to keep women like her small. By the time the limousine passed through the iron gates again, she felt hollow, as though a piece of her had been left in that sterile room. The mansion rose before her, its marble walls glowing in the fading sun. And in that moment, Layla realized the truth. The contract hadn't only bought her body, it had stolen her dignity. The invitation was not a choice. That evening, a maid entered Layla's room, carrying a gown of midnight blue silk, its hemline heavy with embroidery. "Lewis requests your presence at tonight's dinner," she said, her tone rehearsed, her eyes avoiding Layla's. Layla's chest tightened. A dinner meant an audience, and in this mansion, an audience meant judgment. When she descended the grand staircase, Henry was waiting at the bottom, a glass of wine in his hand. His eyes swept over her with the cool detachment of a man assessing presentation rather than beauty. He offered his arm. She hesitated before taking it, her pulse loud in her ears. The dining hall stretched endlessly, the chandelier above blazing like captured sunlight. Around the long mahogany table sat men in tailored suits and women in glittering jewels. Henry's business partners, social allies, pillars of the world that had always been close to her. Their conversations hushed as she entered, replaced by curious stares. Henry's voice was smooth. "This is Layla, my special guest." The phrase hung in the air, polished but sharp. Special guest. Not equal. Not partner. A possession displayed. One woman leaned toward another, whispering behind a jeweled hand. A man's gaze lingered too long, his smirk cutting deeper than words. Layla felt her skin burn under the scrutiny, not just for being there, but for being her. Dark-skinned, in a room where paleness was currency. As she took her seat beside Henry, the conversation resumed, but every laugh, every glance reminded her she was an intruder. A man across the table lifted his glass and said casually, "Henry, you always did have unconventional taste." The word unconventional dripped with disdain. Layla froze. The insult wasn't cloaked, it was branded with centuries of prejudice. Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply sipped his wine as though silence could erase the barb. Layla clenched her hands under the tablecloth nails, biting into her palms. Courses arrived, dishes sculpted like art. She could barely eat, her throat tight, her stomach roiling. The silverware gleamed, the candles flickered, and all she could think about was Malik at home eating reheated rice or bread if he was lucky. Midway through the evening, Henry leaned closer. "Are you all right?" His voice was low, almost tender, but she couldn't tell if it was concern or performance. "I'm trying," she murmured, forcing her eyes forward, refusing to let him see the tears threatening to spill. By the time dessert was served, she felt as though she had been on display for hours. Every smile had been a mask, every word a shield. When the dinner ended, she excused herself quickly, her legs trembling as she climbed the stairs. In the solitude of her room, she tore the gown from her body and stood barefoot by the balcony. The night air was heavy, carrying scents of jasmine and the distant city. She hugged herself tightly, the sound of laughter from the hall below still echoing in her ears. This world would never accept her. Not as a woman, not as a mother, not as a black body brought into a white man's kingdom. Downstairs, crystal glasses clinked. Upstairs, Layla whispered to the night, to Malik, to herself. "One day, I will not be their spectacle." The mansion moved on its own rhythm. Meals at exact hours. Lights dimmed by staff at night. Corridors polished until they shone like mirrors. Yet beneath all the order, Layla felt the chaos of silence pressing in. Days stretched into weeks, each moment tethered to the contract that hung over her like a storm cloud. Henry kept his distance. He spoke to her only about logistics, appointments, routines, schedules. He was disciplined, efficient, calculated. Yet in the quiet moments when he thought no one watched, Layla began to see something different. One afternoon, she found him in the garden, kneeling beside a rosebush. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up, his manicured hands dirt-stained as he carefully pruned thorns. The sight startled her. A man who ruled corporations and bent politicians to his will was on his knees tending to fragile petals. "This was my mother's garden," he said without looking up, sensing her presence. His voice for once lacked its usual steel. She said, "Roses are proof that beauty and pain grow from the same stem." Layla hesitated, then stepped closer. For the first time, he seemed less like a billionaire and more like a boy clinging to memory. She wanted to ask more, but his shoulders stiffened, the mask sliding back into place. Later in the music room, she caught another glimpse. The door was ajar, and from within floated soft piano notes, hesitant but tender. She pushed the door open quietly. Henry sat at the grand piano, his fingers moving with surprising grace. "You play?" she whispered. He stopped instantly, hands lifting as though caught in a crime. "My mother taught me," he said, avoiding her eyes. "It's beautiful." For a flicker of a second, his lips curved, not quite a smile, but something close. Then it was gone, replaced by the cool detachment she had come to know. That night, as Layla walked the empty corridor, she passed Henry by chance. His tie was loosened, his steps heavier than usual. For the first time, she saw fatigue etched into his features. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. "Not really," she admitted. He nodded, almost as though he understood too well. After a pause, he said, "Tea in the library." It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. They sat across from each other at a mahogany table, steam curling from porcelain cups. The library was lined with shelves that reached the ceiling, books untouched by dust. For once, the silence between them wasn't suffocating. It was tentative, fragile, human. "I know this isn't easy," Henry said at last, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I don't intend to make it harder." Layla searched his face, waiting for the trick, the performance. But what she saw in his eyes wasn't power. It was vulnerability, raw and unexpected. She sipped her tea slowly, unsure whether to let her guard down. Her life had taught her that men with power always hid daggers behind kind words. Yet something in his tone, in the faint tremor she caught when he set his cup down, told her he wasn't entirely made of stone. For the first time since stepping into the mansion, she allowed herself a dangerous thought. Maybe Henry Lewis wasn't as unbreakable as he seemed. It happened on a quiet afternoon. The mansion was unusually still, sunlight spilling through tall windows and painting long shadows across the marble floors. Layla had been walking back from the garden when Amira rushed toward her, worry etched on her face. He found something, she whispered urgently. "You should come." Layla's stomach tightened. She followed Amira into the living room, her heart pounding with every step. Henry stood by the fireplace, a photograph in his hand. His posture was rigid, his eyes fixed on the image as though it had betrayed him. The photograph was small, worn at the edges, the only picture Layla had brought with her of Malik. She had hidden it carefully between the pages of a book. Somehow Henry had found it. "Who is this boy?" His voice was calm, but the tension beneath it was sharp as glass. Layla froze, her throat constricted, but she forced the words out. "He's my son. His name is Malik." Silence spread through the room like smoke. Henry turned slowly, his gaze locking onto hers. His eyes, usually unreadable, burned with something darker now. "You lied to me." Layla's chest ached, but she lifted her chin. "I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you. I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" His voice rose slightly, cutting through the stillness. "That I'd see you as unfit, that I'd end this arrangement before it began." "Yes," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought you'd see me as less as a woman already tied to a child, as a black mother who wasn't convenient." The words spilled before she could stop them, weighted with the truth she had carried for too long. Henry's jaw tightened, his silence more dangerous than anger. Finally he spoke. "And yet you agreed to leave one child behind in order to bear another. Explain that." The accusation hit harder than any slap. Tears welled in her eyes, but she held her ground. "I did it for him, for Malik. The bills, the eviction notices, the nights he went to bed hungry. I had no choice. I came here because I couldn't let him starve." Her voice cracked, but the fire in it remained. Henry stared at her for a long, unbearable moment. Then he turned to the window, his back to her. His reflection in the glass looked distant, haunted. "You should have trusted me," he murmured. Layla's tears finally spilled. "Trusted you. From the moment I stepped into this house, I was nothing but a contract to you, a womb you bought. How could I trust that?" The silence that followed was suffocating. When Henry finally turned back, his expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes had shifted. The cold certainty was gone, replaced by a fracture she hadn't seen before. "Leave me," he said quietly. Layla's breath caught. For a moment she thought he meant forever, but his tone carried something else, conflict, not dismissal. She stepped back slowly, her heart heavy, her hands trembling. As she reached the door, she heard the faintest break in his voice. "I need time." She left him standing there, the photograph of Malik still clutched in his hand. And for the first time, the mansion felt less like a prison of stone and more like a battlefield, one where truth had been unleashed and nothing could return to silence again. The next evening, Henry summoned her to the library. The fire crackled in the hearth shadows, dancing across rows of leather-bound books. He sat behind a mahogany desk, Malik's photograph placed neatly in front of him. Layla entered cautiously, bracing for judgment, for punishment, for the end. But Henry's voice was steady, almost measured. "I've reviewed the contract. There is nothing in it about secrets. Still, trust has been broken, and without trust, we have nothing." Layla's breath caught. "Please," she whispered, "don't send me away. I'll honor every part of the agreement." He raised a hand, silencing her. "I'm not ending this, but I am setting a condition." He slid a paper across the desk. "You may visit your son. I will arrange it. But he cannot know the truth. Not about me. Not about why you're here." Layla blinked, stunned. She hadn't expected generosity, not from him. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Henry's gaze flickered, distant, pained. "Because I know what it is to grow up without answers. I won't take your presence away from him completely." His words carried more weight than she understood, but she didn't question further. She only nodded, clutching the lifeline he had offered. The following week, a black car carried her through winding streets to the small neighborhood she had left behind. With every block, her heart raced faster. When the car stopped, she stepped out onto cracked pavement, her chest tight with anticipation. And then she saw him. Malik ran from the doorway of their tiny apartment, his little legs carrying him as fast as they could. "Mommy!" he cried, his voice high with joy. Layla dropped to her knees, gathering him into her arms. His small body pressed against hers, warm and fragile. She buried her face in his curls, inhaling the familiar scent of soap and childhood. Tears spilled freely, unchecked. "You came back," he said breathlessly, smiling up at her. "I promised I would," she whispered, though the word promise felt heavy with uncertainty. They spent the day together as if the world outside didn't exist. She cooked for him in their tiny kitchen, played board games, and listened to his stories about school. Every laugh, every hug was a reminder of why she endured the unbearable. But as the sun dipped low, shadows stretched across the room. The driver appeared at the door, a silent reminder that her time was over. Malik clung to her waist. "When will you come back?" "Soon, my love," she said, her voice breaking. She kissed his forehead, imprinting the moment in her memory, as though it had to last forever. Back at the mansion, Henry was waiting in the living room. His expression was calm, but his eyes searched her face. "How is he?" he asked quietly. Layla sank into the sofa, exhausted and hollow. "He's happy, he's growing, but it hurt to leave him again." Henry nodded slowly, his gaze lowering to the floor. "I know that pain." For the first time, Layla saw something almost human in him. Not the billionaire, not the master of contracts, but a man scarred by absences he never chose. She said nothing more. The silence between them was fragile, but it wasn't empty. It was shared. The mansion's corridors felt different after the visit to Malik. The air was lighter somehow, though Layla's chest still ached from the goodbye. She filled her days with long walks through the gardens, her evenings staring at stars from the balcony, her nights restless with dreams of her son's smile. Henry kept his distance, but she began to notice small shifts. The man who once moved like marble, cold, unyielding, now revealed cracks she hadn't expected. One morning she found a tray outside her door. On it were dishes from her childhood okra stew, cornbread-spiced rice meals she had mentioned once in passing weeks earlier. She carried the tray inside, staring at it as if it were a puzzle. Who had remembered? When she asked Amira, the housekeeper only smiled. Mr. Lewis gave the instructions. Layla's throat tightened. She tasted the food slowly, every bite layered with memory. It wasn't perfect, but it was an attempt. And in that attempt, she saw a man reaching across the gulf he had created. Later in the library, she discovered a stack of books waiting on her table. Novels by Black authors. Stories of struggle and triumph. She had once mentioned she wished Malik could read someday. Their spines gleamed under the lamplight, a quiet acknowledgement of her words. That evening she walked into the music room, drawn by faint notes on the piano. Henry sat at the keys again, his fingers moving with hesitant grace. This time he didn't stop when she entered. "My mother loved this piece," he said softly, not looking at her. Layla stepped closer, her voice low. "It sounds like grief, but also like hope." His hands faltered for a moment before continuing. "Maybe that's why I play it. For a while they stayed there, two people bound by a contract, yet connected by something unspoken. The next day she spotted him in the gardens. A small bird had fallen from a branch, its wing bent at an unnatural angle. Layla knelt instinctively, cradling it gently in her palms. Henry approached, his expression unreadable. "What will you do with it?" "I'll care for it until it can fly again," she said simply. For the first time, admiration flickered in his eyes, quiet and sincere. That night, as she wandered the corridor, she nearly collided with him outside the library. His tie was loosened, his shoulders tense. He looked at her with exhaustion that no fortune could hide. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Not tonight." They ended up sharing tea again, the library warm with firelight. For the first time, their conversation wasn't about contracts or rules. They spoke of childhood memories, hers filled with community and hardship, his filled with wealth and loneliness. When silence finally fell, it wasn't suffocating. It was fragile, almost tender. Layla realized then that Henry Lewis, the man who had bought her body, was not invincible. He was fractured, haunted, lonely. And in those fragments of humanity, she glimpsed a truth she hadn't expected. The cage she lived in wasn't built only for her. It was built for him, too. Rain lashed against the tall windows, the storm outside rattling the glass as if demanding to be let in. Layla stood by the fire in the library, her arms wrapped around herself, the heat doing little to ease the chill that had settled in her chest. She had lived in the mansion long enough to know its rhythms, the scheduled meals, the silent staff, Henry's measured footsteps echoing down the corridors. Yet tonight, those rhythms felt unbearable. The door creaked open. Henry entered, his suit jacket draped over one arm, his tie loosened. His eyes carried the heaviness of a man who had not slept. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Layla turned her jaw tight. "About the contract." His gaze dropped briefly before returning to her. "About more than that." She waited silent. Henry crossed the room and placed a folder on the table. Inside were legal papers, amendments, revisions, possibilities. But Layla didn't look at them. She looked at him. "What do you want from me, Henry?" Her voice shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion. "You bought me. You asked me to carry your child. You gave me money in exchange for my silence. What else is left?" His shoulders tensed. "I want you to understand that this isn't just transactional anymore." Layla's laugh was bitter. "Transactional is all it ever was. You think because you send books to my room or bring me meals from my childhood that it erases the truth that I'm not here against my will?" His jaw tightened. "I never wanted to hurt you. But you did." Her voice rose now, cutting through the storm outside. "Do you know what it feels like to be treated as property your whole life? To be called exotic instead of human? To know that your skin makes people decide who you are before you even speak? And then to stand on a stage and hear the sound of your worth measured in millions like cattle." Her chest heaved. The silence that followed was thick, trembling. For once, Henry didn't have an immediate reply. He looked away, his hands braced against the desk as though her words had knocked the air from his lungs. Finally, he said, his voice low, "You're right. I've spent my life using money to control everything, to silence what I couldn't face. But with you..." He stopped struggling, the mask slipping. "With you, I can't ignore the truth anymore." Layla's eyes burned, but she didn't look away. "Then stop hiding behind contracts. Stop acting like control is the same as love. If you want me to believe anything you say, then see me not as a womb, not as an arrangement. As a woman, as a mother, as black, as human." The storm thundered outside, shaking the windows. Henry's silence stretched long, but his eyes, haunted, uncertain, did not leave hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can be that man." Layla stepped closer, her voice steady now. "Then you'll never have me." "Not really." The words hung in the air, raw and unyielding. For the first time since she had entered the mansion, Layla felt something shift, not in him, but in herself. She had broken the silence, and the echo of her truth was something Henry Lewis could no longer ignore. The test results came back on a bright morning, the sun pouring through the tall windows, as though mocking her. Layla sat on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling in her hands. Positive. The child was growing inside her. She pressed her palm against her abdomen, the gesture instinctive, protective. But instead of comfort, a storm of fear churned through her chest. What would the world see when this child was born? She had lived long enough to know that skin carried weight heavier than any crown. Malik's blackness had already marked him in ways his innocence couldn't understand. Teachers doubted him before he spoke. Strangers crossed the street when he passed. What future would await a child of two worlds, half black, half white, carrying the blood of a billionaire whose empire thrived on appearances? At breakfast, Henry noticed the change in her expression. His eyes searched hers, but she said nothing. She couldn't bring herself to share the fragile news with him, not yet. Instead, she retreated to the gardens, walking the stone paths until her legs ached. She remembered her grandmother's warnings. This country doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. It will always find a way to remind you of your place. She looked down at her hands, dark against the ivory fabric of her dress, and imagined tiny fingers curling around her finger. Would they be Malik's shade? Would they be lighter? Would the world treat them differently, depending on the answer? That night, as rain tapped softly against the balcony doors, Henry knocked and entered without waiting. He carried a glass of wine, though his eyes looked tired, restless. "You've been quiet," he said. Layla hesitated, then met his gaze. "I'm pregnant." The words froze the air between them. Henry set the glass down slowly, as if afraid it might shatter. For a long moment he said nothing, then his lips parted, his voice low. "It's what we planned, what I wanted, what you wanted," she corrected. Her voice wavered, but she forced the truth out. "Do you know what this means? For me, for my son, for the child inside me. This isn't just about contracts or heirs, Henry. This is about a life that will be judged before it takes its first breath." Henry's face hardened, but not in anger. In conflict. He leaned against the desk, his jaw tight, his silence heavy. Layla stepped closer, her voice trembling but fierce. "When that child is born, they'll look at me and see a black mother who sold herself. They'll look at you and see a powerful white man who bought me, and they'll look at our child and see nothing but scandal. Do you understand the weight of that? Do you understand the cruelty they'll face?" He didn't answer. His silence was confirmation enough. Layla turned away, staring out at the storm beyond the balcony. "I've already raised one black child in a world that tries to break him every day. I will not let this one grow up without knowing that their worth is not defined by money or contracts or skin." For a moment, she thought she saw Henry flinch, as if her words had struck deeper than she knew. But when she looked back, his face was a mask again, calm and controlled. "You'll have everything you need," he said. "Protection, resources, security." Layla shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "That's not what this child needs. They need freedom. They need dignity. They need to know they're more than a signature on a piece of paper." The silence between them was vast, filled with the cries of unborn futures and the echoes of histories that could not be erased. And in that silence, Layla realized the truth. This child was already caught between two worlds, and it was up to her to fight so that they wouldn't be broken by either. The announcement came without warning. One evening, Henry stood at the head of the long dining table, his voice steady as he informed a room full of investors and relatives, "I will have an heir. The child will bear my name." The words dropped like stones into water, sending ripples of shock across polished faces. Forks clattered against china. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Eyes shifted toward Layla, who sat at the far end of the table, her hands trembling in her lap. Whispers surged. With her a black woman. The words weren't spoken aloud, but they vibrated in the glances, in the sneers disguised as smiles. Layla's skin burned. Every look reminded her that she was the disruption at their table, the scandal wrapped in silk. When the dinner ended, Henry walked her to the corridor. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. "You didn't tell me you would announce it," she said, her voice sharp. He stopped facing her squarely. It had to be done. The world needs to know. The world. Her laugh was bitter. Do you mean your partners, your family, the people who just looked at me as if I'd polluted your bloodline? Henry's eyes darkened, but he didn't look away. Let them talk. It changes nothing. It changes everything, Layla shot back. Her voice rose, echoing down the empty hall. That child will carry my skin, my history. Do you think money can erase the way they'll be treated? Do you think your last name will shield them when the world sees what they are? His silence cut deeper than anger. That night, Layla couldn't sleep. She paced her room, her hand pressed protectively to her stomach. Images flooded her mind, newspapers splashing her face across headlines, strangers whispering in corridors, her child growing up under the weight of shame they did not deserve. By morning, the consequences had begun. The mansion phone rang endlessly, journalists, relatives, business associates, some congratulatory, many outraged. She overheard snippets as staff whispered in corners, "He's lost his mind. With her, it will ruin everything." When she entered the hall, two of Henry's cousins passed by. They didn't lower their voices. First he buys her, then he parades her. Disgraceful. Layla's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to claw back her dignity, but she walked on her head, held high. That evening, Henry found her on the balcony. The city lights glittered beyond the gardens, distant and indifferent. "You're angry," he said simply. "I'm terrified," she replied. "For what?" "For our child," she whispered. "For the cruelty that will fall on them before they can even speak. For Malik, who will be dragged into this scandal too. For myself, because every whisper, every insult is a reminder that in their eyes, I will never be enough." Henry was silent for a long time. The mask he wore so well cracked just slightly. I thought, if I stood beside you, it would protect you. Layla turned her eyes burning. "Protection isn't silence, Henry. It isn't throwing me to wolves and then standing in the shadows. If you want to protect us, you'll have to fight for me, for Malik, for this child. Not with money, with truth." The wind carried her words into the night. For the first time, Henry didn't argue. He only nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes haunted. But Layla knew this was only the beginning. The world outside was sharpening its knives, and inside the mansion, the walls of power were starting to crack. The storm finally broke inside the mansion. One morning, Henry summoned his lawyers. They arrived in dark suits, carrying briefcases, heavy with contracts and consequences. Layla sat across the room, her stomach tight, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly. She braced herself for another negotiation over her body, her future, her child. But Henry surprised her. He stood by the window, the light casting long shadows across his face. In his hand, he held the original contract, the very paper that had trapped her in this world. Without a word, he tore it down the middle. The rip echoed louder than thunder. Then he tore it again, and again, until the fragments lay scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Layla's breath caught. Henry looked at her, then his voice low but steady. "This no longer defines us. Not you, not me, not the child." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Lewis, this decision could leave us." Henry ordered, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. The men obeyed, their footsteps fading down the hall. Silence filled the room. Layla stared at the torn papers, her heart pounding. "Why now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Henry stepped closer, his eyes unguarded for once. "Because I've lived my life obeying expectations, my father's, my family's, society's. And all it brought me was emptiness. But with you, I've been forced to see things I never dared to face. The prejudice, the hypocrisy, my own cowardice." Layla shook her head, tears welling. "You think tearing paper changes what the world will say about us, about our child? Do you think they'll suddenly see me as more than a contract you bought?" "No," he admitted. "But I do." The words hung between them, fragile, unfinished. Layla turned away, her hand gripping the balcony railing. The garden stretched out below, calm, and ordered, mocking her chaos. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she whispered. You've stolen pieces of me I can never get back. My dignity, my choices." Henry's voice broke for the first time. "Then don't forgive me, but let me stand beside you. Let me fight for you, not with contracts, not with money, but with truth." Layla closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. For so long she had dreamed of escape for herself, for Malik, for the child she now carried. Freedom had been the light at the end of every sleepless night. And yet here it was not in open doors or broken chains, but in a choice only she could make. She turned slowly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "If you mean this, if you truly want to stand with me, you have to understand that it's not just about us. It's about Malik. It's about this child. It's about facing a world that will hate what we represent." Henry met her gaze without flinching. "Then, let them hate. I'm done living in silence." For the first time she believed him, not because his words were perfect, but because his fear was real, visible in the tremor of his hands, the cracks in his voice. Layla took a deep breath. The decision weighed heavy, but it was hers. Finally hers. "I won't be owned again," she said firmly. "If we build a future, it will be because I choose it, not because you bought it." Henry nodded as if sealing a vow. The torn contract lay at their feet, the last symbol of chains undone. And in that moment, Layla realized she was standing at the threshold of something terrifying, uncertain, yet free.